Welcome to the Paper Boats podcast. My name's Ian Grosz. I'm a researcher and writer, and like many people, I'm concerned about our deepening environmental crises. In each episode of this podcast, I'll be meeting with a different writer from the Paper Boats collective. We'll discuss their work and the issues that they write about. Paper Boats are a group of writers from across Scotland and beyond, inspired by Kathleen Jamie's poetic response to COP26. They're working together to highlight the impacts of climate change, the ecological collapse we are witness to, and the things we can do to help bring about positive change. If you're concerned about climate change, want to delve further into the issues surrounding it, and like great writing, follow and subscribe to the Paper Boats podcast to hear from a host of fantastic nature writers. A further welcome to you all then to episode 2 of the Paper Boats podcast, and joining us remotely today is author and creative writing tutor Linda Cracknell. Hi Linda, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you.
Good. I can hear you and you can hear me, so that's a good start. So I'll just introduce you properly then. Linda writes non-fiction, fiction and radio drama. Landscape, place and memory are key themes in Linda's work, and she runs regular creative writing workshops, often focusing on an engagement with the outdoors. Her work has been nominated for a Saltire First Book Award and the Robin Jenkins Award for Environmental Writing. Her essay collection, Doubling Back, 10 Paths Trodden in Memory, was first published by Freight Books in 2014 and was serialised for BBC Radio as a Book of the Week. A new edition has just been published this year, 2024, by Saraband, and incorporates an additional essay on a journey through Scotland's flow country, which is just become a UNESCO World Heritage Site recognised for its unique habitat. Linda published an article on the flow country in the Herald in August 2024. So, welcome again, Linda. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we talk about your journey through the flow country, I wondered if you could let listeners know how you became involved with the Paper Boats group, the Paper Boats collective.
Yes, the Paper Boats Collective really came about through, I think a sort of getting together of writers with a concern about the climate crisis. And the first gathering that I took part in was actually at the Edinburgh International Book Festival. I think that was last year, 2023. And it was a very positive event because we simply took a table and encouraged people. We took lots of different kinds of paper and maps and all sorts of things and encouraged people to make a paper boat. And whilst that was going on, we had conversations with people about the climate crisis in a context in which books were being considered, obviously. Mm-hmm. And I think it's quite pertinent for writers to get involved in this because we tend to be observers of the world, and I think it's clear that there's a great concern amongst many people about this issue. Yeah. And it's going to start being very predominant, I think, in writing generally.
Yeah, so you think if you're a writer at all, you have a sort of responsibility to bear witness in a way?
I don't even know if it's exactly a responsibility, although that could be the case, but just that it's likely to be reflected in writing because it's impinging on all of our consciousnesses, and it's alarming and frightening and very concerning for future generations.
And so much part of life now, isn't it? Climate change has become part of everybody's lives. So it's, I guess, in that sense, it's hard not to write about it, whatever you write, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's the connection with Paper Boats, which you continue to have, and let's talk a little bit now about the book Doubling Back, wonderful book, which I have here, the original version. I'm sort of proud about that. And I just wondered why in the re-edition by Saraband you chose to visit the flow country and include that as an additional walk in the series. And perhaps you could go over what the book, the structure of the book, and what the aim of the book is as well for listeners.
Yes, I have to sort of go back quite a long way, because, as you said, the original publication was 10 years ago, and the walks in the book were some years before that,
Mm,
because it took quite a long time for the book to find its form. But the journey that really set the whole project off was a walk in Norway, in which I was invited to join a friend and her siblings, who were following in the footsteps of their Norwegian father
yeah,
on his escape route during the war. He'd been captured on the coast, and he managed to escape, and then he found a route across Norway into safety in Sweden. Took him 6 months. And on the 60th anniversary of this, the family had decided to go and reenact the walk. He'd written about it, which meant that we could actually find the route. And so I went with them. And the main reason for me being there was because I was experienced in doing a long distance walk, and they'd never walked point to point with a tent. Um, and it, became evident quite soon, because actually we didn't have enough food or anything like that for the first few days walking. But it was really interesting because I'd never thought before of doing a long distance walk that was commemorative.
yeah,
And it's a very powerful action, I think, as a commemoration. And then I began to think, well, why haven't I done a walk after my own father, who died when I was very young, too young to remember him. And he was a keen mountaineer. And so I started to think, oh, well, that would take me to the Alps, because I knew that he'd been an alpine mountaineer. And then I started to think of it as a wider project, and think of all the fascinations that I'd had with old roots, that sense that you do, very tangible sense that you get in the land sometimes, where there's been a route that's been reused and reused by a community of some sort, whether it's simply a walk to a well, or whether it's a 200-mile drove route through the Highlands. And so I started to think in terms of doing a number of walks which in some way would relate to memories.
yeah.
So when the book came out in 2013, it was 10 books which were paired in some way. So two were following writers, for example, two followed fathers, and so on. Two were following old community ways. Um, and it was very much about memory and how that can
Mm,
be evoked through walking. But when it came to the reissue with Saraband, I had this opportunity to add another walk, and I found myself taking a slightly different position on it, perhaps because I'm a bit older, was one thing, because actually the walk had quite a long pause in it, which wasn't something I used to do when I was younger. Um, but also, it seemed to me that there was something very topical about the flow country, partly because at the time it was in the running to be a World Heritage Centre, to have World Heritage status. And also partly because it was becoming evident that it was so critical to the climate crisis. And the reason for that, I think, will become more apparent when I do the reading.
okay.
But these two things made me think. I'm also very drawn to the north of Scotland. I've written a novel which is set on the north coast of Caithness, and I always feel that that part of Scotland is unfairly maligned as being sort of grey um, and featureless and
Yeah,
not worth anything. And so people, typically people have thought of the flow country as somewhere that you can dump things or
yeah. Or set up
plant
space
huge
launch pads.
conifer plantations. um, so I thought it would be really challenging, but interesting to come up with a walk across it. And I wasn't walking across the whole flow country by any means. It was a short walk, um, in terms of the wider expanse of 25 miles between Kinbrace and the Crask Inn, which is due west. But along the way, as I say, I stopped and did a circuit of stopped by Lochcoyer, and then did a circuit of the local hills, because actually that's a part of the flow country usually thought of as being flat, which is actually quite mountainous. So I did a circuit of those hills, and then stayed put. I stayed put in the same camping spot for 3 nights. It was an amazing place. but also because I like to pause these days. I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. To just get a greater sense of a place by just being there for a while.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I believe you are going to read for us now. If you would, that'd be lovely to.
I will do. So this is an extract from the middle of the piece. I don't think I need to set it up too much because it's evident where we are. So for those who don't know, Forsenard is a little to the northeast of where I was starting the walk. But there's a very interesting RSPB centre there, which is all about the flow country. So it's quite a good point of reference for anyone who's interested in visiting. I visited Forsenard just before my departure on foot from Kinbrace, wilting in heat as I crossed the bog on a boardwalk. Lizards lounged on it. Dragonflies glinted. I'd last climbed the high observatory here on a frigid February day when snow highlighted mossy bridges between black pools, the Du Lochen. A few meters of elevation allow us to appreciate such flatlands. On this July day, the dance of bog cotton was joyful. The pools, offered up by the platforms of peat at different levels, reflected bright blue sky, rimmed with colourful moss cushions and golden grasses. Spires of yellow bog asphodel seemed to challenge the usual adjectives for this treeless terrain: desolate, lonely, isolated, bleak. Down again beside a pool, I dropped to my knees to hold a hand lens above a plump hummock, tightly packed with florets of red sphagnum moss. There are three predominant types in the flow country, and this one was acute-leaved bog moss, or Sphagnum capiliofolium. In magnification, a forest of succulent serrated branches glistened, jellyish in pink and russet translucence. Pulling out a single strand, I found a darker spore cup on the floret and a tangle of shiny arms curling towards its base. A riddle spoke itself. What is plant but mostly water? When I looked up from this miniature magic through a low jungle of bogbean, each plant doubled in height by its reflection, the whole western vista was backed by the rise of two interleaving peaks, the Ben Griams, miniature and magnitude. Why do we think of this landscape as boring? The hot, dry months across Scotland before my visit had also created some areas of crazed bare peat. Since my earlier walks, the climate crisis has roared into centre stage, demanding action as, in the summer of 2023, fires burn around the world and floodwaters rise. It's predicted that 9 out of 10 alpine glaciers will have melted by the end of this century. Since 2008, when, in the footsteps of my father, I walked the longest glacier in the Alps, the Aletsch has dramatically ablated, shrinking up to 50 meters in length each year and retreating at its edges. Perhaps the prints and markers of both mine and, 56 years before me, my father's way, will already have been fully erased. I was learning now that in the flow country context, wet is good, but drought or lengthy periods of low rainfall are becoming increasingly common in Scotland. Peatland here was degraded in the 1980s by being drained and ploughed for vast swathes of non-native conifer, controversially driven by government's tax breaks for the wealthy, including Terry Wogan and Alex Higgins. These incentives were awarded despite the fact such trees don't thrive on peat-rich soil. It prompted land rights activist Andy Whiteman to ask why the government didn't simply give the money as grants to the crofters, farmers and landowners in Caithness and Sutherland so that they could plant the forests. This gold rush cultivation led to a bitter battle between commercial foresters and conservationists who foresaw that the peat bog would die, and with it, wildlife. Peat bogs became mired in capitalism. And of course, what I didn't say in that particular extract was that in their wet condition, these peat bogs are a huge climate they capture huge amounts of carbon,
Yeah.
and so are therefore vital to the climate crisis that we're in. But should they dry out, they'll release it into the atmosphere,
Yeah.
which
So
will
it's a
have a
potential.
significant impact.
Yeah, potential time bomb going off. It's a negative
Mm.
feedback system, isn't it? But to go back to your writing, that was beautiful. The way you helped the reader totally zoom in there and see that sort of macro detail, that minute detail of the mosses, and then we zoom out again into the wider issues that it connects with. But that's a sort of signature, if you don't mind me saying so, feature of your writing, that close observation, that detailed look at nature in particular. And I know it's part of your practice, which you share with people in the pamphlet Writing Landscape, also published by Saraband last year. And I just wondered if that practice is something perhaps we all should do generally, just to take more notice of nature and reconnect with it, and to try and combat that disconnect that seems to have happened between us and nature.
Yes, certainly I do. And I think there's very good evidence that it's extremely good for individuals, both sort of in terms of physical and mental health as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as you say, I mean, actually, one of the things I often say is walking is absolutely essential to my writing practice, and also I think just to my well-being. It has been for a very long time, even before I was writing. And I know that's true for many people, or they discover it to be true once introduced to
Yeah.
it. But I think the opportunities to notice are significant. And I often find that if I pause and deliberately notice, I find there's a lot more there than I had realized. And that can be both in terms of it. Actually, sometimes I might pause just with my notebook and just jot a few things down that I notice, not just visually, but through my other senses as well. And I'm that intensifies the experience of being there and the appreciation of it as well. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it can lead into an inquiry into, well, why is that flower growing there, or why was it growing there, but it's not growing there anymore.
Yeah.
So I think these kind of inquiries are very healthy and very good for our learning, actually. And I think, that's got to be a good thing in terms
Yeah.
of us valuing nature, and so therefore wanting to do something about the situation that we're in.
And is that something you bring into your workshops and the engagements that you do with creative writing workshops that you do, that incorporates that an element outdoors?
Yes, I'm afraid I'm famous for making people sort of get down on their hands and knees. And, I've just been teaching a non-fiction week course, and I mean nobody complained, but I did insist that even if they were writing something that wasn't about nature at all, that we went outside and actually observed closely. And it's the people really focus in a really interesting way when they get the
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to do that. I think we probably don't give ourselves permission
No, I
to do.
think we probably feel silly most of the time, don't we? But
Well, maybe, yes, yeah,
so it's
yeah.
nice when you encounter an experience like that gives you permission to be a
Yes,
child again, I
yes.
suppose.
Hmm.
So going back to you talking about how important walking is to you as a writer in your practice, I'd like to just read a little section out of the book which says that you say, walking links places and so creates continuity, places occurring both in physical and inner landscapes. We discover ourselves as we discover the world. I think that's a lovely statement or sentiment there, and I wondered if...
Did I write that?
Yes, you did, yeah. That's by Linda Cracknell, and doubling back. So I wondered if... Can you go a bit further into why walking and writing are sort of linked for you, and memory?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could write very effectively. Well, without walking. I think writing really helps me walk. No, the other way around. Walking really helps me write. Because it's partly the rhythm, I think,
Yeah.
and the way that your thoughts, as you walk, your thoughts um, are sometimes in an internal, especially if you're walking on your own, are sometimes in an internal monologue, and sometimes are outward turned and observing things. And I often find, and this does relate perhaps first and foremost to writing fiction, but also to nonfiction, is that the solutions to writing problems often come for me during a walk. And I think it's because my mind is only half engaged with it. It's left it
Mm.
behind, but it hasn't quite. And so it might just be something that I notice that that's just the detail that I need
Yeah.
to fill out a character or to make the bridge between two incidents. Um, and I think, yeah, so it's partly that. I think I think it's a lot to do with the sort of the way that your mind works in walking, which is quite different to when you're sitting at a desk, being
Hmm.
very static.
So,
I've always found it part of my toolbox for writing. Started very much as a fiction writer, but it was always a very important tool for me. And it was really because I was walking a lot that, and I've always been interested in longer walks as well and doing expedition walks. But it was because I was walking that I began to think, well, I'm walking to write. Maybe I could turn that into a subject matter as well.
hmm, yeah, it's a long history of it being linked, isn't it? Like Rebecca Solnit's book Wanderlust, and uh, just because I guess it's a journey. A walk is a journey, isn't it? And a narrative is a journey, and they're very closely linked. Do you
Yes.
use walking in your creative writing workshops as well? Do you introduce that idea to people, or is it more about the noticing and taking notice?
Um, I do encourage some walking, and actually one of the exercises that I sometimes give is to present people with a line from a poem and ask them to walk with it in their head
Hmm.
and just see if another line comes. And sometimes they come back with a whole poem,
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't, but and I think it's just that, poetry is about often about rhythm.
Rhythm.
So that's a very useful way into it. But in general, the workshops are a little bit more static than that because you can do a lot more if you're not walking from place to place as
Hmm.
well. So yeah, limited, I think.
You touched on being a fiction writer there, and your grounding really is as a fiction writer, isn't it? The first book you brought
Yes,
out was
it
a
is.
collection of short stories.
Mm.
How does that grounding in fiction, do you think, impact or influence the way you approach the doubling back, or some of the non-fiction work you do now?
I think stylistically, I mean, I think the my fiction and my non-fiction focus on place.
Hmm.
So place is central to both. And that's increasingly, I'd say when I first started writing short stories, that wasn't so much the case, but now it's very much the case. So the novel that came out in 2013, Call of the Undertow, was set very firmly on the north coast of Caithness, and it was about a very specific place and its features and how that worked with a particular character who wasn't belonging to that place.
Mm.
Um, and so that's, I would say, now a firm feature of my fiction writing.
Why is place increasingly featured, and why do you think what is it that draws you to place, and why do you think it's important to your writing and the way you approach work?
I think first and foremost, it's inspired by how very differently I feel in different places.
Mm.
So, the effect that a particular place can have on me. Sometimes not, it may not be obvious why, but in the case of that particular place in Caithness, it was when I first got to know it, it was the end of the winter, and it was incredibly harsh, um, and exposed and brittle and elemental, really, in a way that I wasn't familiar with. Um, and so I couldn't help but start to think about how another character would relate to it.
Hmm.
Um, and how differently we feel. I've just coming to the end of a non-fiction book about which is well, it's sort of a generational story, but it's got a lot of sea in it, including some sailing, and how differently I feel when I'm at sea,
Hmm.
particularly being outside of land. That presented to me in advance as a horrible idea, of actually sailing out and not being able to see land. But when it happened, it was actually very beautiful and very interesting in the sense of how human life appears to be in the right proportion to this. It's as if I've experienced a similar kind of feeling. I go regularly to do a workshop in the Sahara Desert, same place every time. And one of the things that I enjoy there is a sense of being, my proportion to the place is very evident
Yeah.
by the scale of the opening out of the landscape, which is much wider than where I live in Highland Perthshire amongst hills. And there's something stark about that, but also that feels proportionate. It feels like that's about the size of a human life in relation to, you're clearly on a planet when you're in that situation. You are.
Humbling.
Yeah.
Going back to Caithness then, and the issues of climate change, what insights did you get in visiting the place and walking through that landscape and paying close attention as you did?
Yeah. Well, I guess that I didn't experience anything very specifically climate related while I was there, except for the human interventions where forestry is concerned, because obviously these big incentives have been given in the 1980s to plant the conifers. And while I was there, it was obvious that they were all being felled, and the drainage ditches that had been created to dry the peat out to make that growing viable were all being filled in. So there was this whole re-wetting operation was starting, and I think this will be significant now. There'll be big efforts, and I assume that now, because there's World Heritage status, that'll free up money and resources to make that possible to do in a more widespread way.
Right. So you think it'll be
Um,
it'll have a positive influence on that landscape, the UNESCO World
I
Heritage
would
status?
certainly hope that would be the case, that the sort of the re-wetting project will be more comprehensive, not just on land that's owned by RSPB or other conservation organisations. But yeah, the plantations will come down, which will make it look quite different
Yeah,
again, I
yeah.
think, because we have got used to them being there. Another thing that fascinated me about being there was that notion of these kind of minute layers building up and building up, and everything that's recorded. I mean, that did come back to memory in this theme of memory, because there's all this recording that's being done by what's been captured in the peat, whether it's the pollen of previous years or whether it's, a mammoth's tusk or, whatever there's down there.
People
Um,
taking core samples from the peat
yes, yeah.
through all the
So
layers.
that's a very, I think it must be a really interesting thing to be a peat scientist, because
Yeah.
it's yeah, fascinating.
And you say in the close of your piece in the Herald that it's a landscape that offers us hope. Um, and is that because of the work you're seeing being done to re-wet areas that have previously been dried out, and a reversal of that commercial exploitation? And how do you feel about the future for Caithness? Do you personally feel hopeful that it will?
I do feel hopeful that with the help of the World Heritage status, that the re-wetting project will be successful. But it is going to take political will and resources to do it. But it is, it's a very large area and could have a significant impact. And it certainly would have a significant negative impact if it's allowed to dry out.
Yeah, if we do nothing, which is
Mm,
been
mhm.
been the approach so far, hasn't it? Um, Thanks so much for your insight, Linda, and for sharing your wonderful writing with us today. If any listeners would like to keep up to date with Linda's writing and her workshops, you can follow her on Instagram, if you don't mind that plug, at Linda underscore Cracknell underscore writer, or you can visit her website at lindacracknell.com. So, Linda, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome, very welcome.
I heard the beautiful promises. And sure, I'm a river, but I can take a side. From this day I'd rather keep afloat like wee folded paper boats, the hopes of the young folk chanting at my bank, fear in their spring bright eyes. So hear this, fail them and I will rise.
Paper Boats supports Global Justice Now and the Scottish Rewilding Alliance. To learn more about their campaigns and Paper Boats writers, go to paperboats.org.